In the past few years, Ghana has done incredibly well in other areas, but when it comes to the social sector, we are struggling with quite a few issues. And one of the biggest is sanitation. Our focus is on the CSOs, looking at how civil society generated information or data and evidence has been used to influence the sanitation sector. CSOs are civil society organizations. We focus on what is called the I Am Aware project, because it's about awareness for individuals. And then there's another one called the District League Table, which puts districts in a league depending on how they're performing around the social indicators.
Sanitation is considered one of the most powerful drivers of human development in Ghana and other places. The government of Ghana has also prioritized sanitation as a major area to deal with health challenges and support women and girls and so on.
The Ministry of Sanitation and Water Resources is the government agency with the mandate of ensuring or overseeing the provision of sanitation and water for all in the country. And so we are tasked with the mandate of ensuring that we have sustainable liquid waste and then solid waste services across the country.
Presently, we're looking at a national coverage of about 15%. That tells you that there's something seriously wrong.
The president himself recognized that we had a problem with sanitation, and so he's made commitments to that. Establishing the ministry was a big step, and then putting resources behind the sector. But along the way has also been a lot of work between CSOs and government. As a country or as a community, we tend to be very inclusive. In Ghana, CSOs are very heavily involved in service delivery, and in the water and sanitation sector in particular, mainly because it hasn't been a big priority for government. And so it's been a source of advocacy and a lot of interest from CSOs.
So really the journey started for us from the sense that we're seeing citizens are not engaging in the governance and development processes in this country. And also the fact that government in of itself, even though we've had a democracy, that should say that government should be accountable, government should be responsive. One of the questions that sort of came to us, particularly for citizens, the question about access to information and what kinds of evidence is available to foster citizens' demand, to empower citizens to be able to make the kinds of demands, and by extension, government responding to the demands of citizens. We started to say, so what kinds of evidence do we think is useful for both citizens and duty bearers to sort of look at and have a dialogue around how that evidence informs the kinds of outcomes that we all want. And so we started off collecting data around certain key service sectors that we thought were important. Once we collected this data, the question then becomes, how then do you make this data accessible for citizens? Data in of itself does not say anything, but you ought to put it in a manner that makes it more salient. And so that's what we did by doing a performance ranking of a sort to sort of rank the data, but also across geographical space. Then the question then becomes, how do you present this evidence that you have about government-owned performance around these issues? Then we sort of set up a national launch where we launched the report, and then some policy recommendations are discussed. But most importantly, because our focus also is on local government, the question then becomes, how do you get the information down to local government so that at least it generates some kind of accountability and responsiveness around those issues that we think that are important for citizens.
We have been involved together with other civil society organizations like the Coalition of NGOs in Water and Sanitation. We support them and other local NGOs to collect data around sanitation. Part of that data is used to support planning at the subnational level. To a large extent as well, we try to engage government on some of its commitments. So as much as possible, we draw evidence from what is happening on the ground to be able to engage with policymakers. And we take it as far as parliamentary select committees to be able to engage with them to make sure that a number of things happen. One, that government's commitment to sanitation is delivered. And then secondly, that when government commits to increase funding to the water and sanitation sector, that it actually does so, through annual budgetary allocation. And lastly, and for us, most importantly, we want to make sure that whatever budget is released actually gets to the point of use, and that it is used on the purposes for which the funds were released.
What has happened is for citizens groups and CBOs, they have taken this data and used it to lobby government, especially at the district level, to provide some of the services. Because actually at the end of the day, it was about services, and they would take this and convince their districts to provide the facilities that are missing. They've used it at all levels actually to make a good case. Now we are seeing more competition amongst the districts to show each other off, and see who ranks better than the other, which I think is useful, especially for the average citizen, because then it means they outdo each other doing better. I think we are finding also a lot more traction around CSOs and government collaborating on sanitation, because it's one of the key indicators.
So this exercise has actually opened up the way for sanitation to interact with the other departments. Hitherto, which was not like that. Sanitation used to always work. Mostly when we go on monitoring, we realize that they were working, and then sometimes the senior management doesn't even know what they were doing. But this exercise has actually brought sanitation units into the limelight for those areas that we have actually started implementing, and the MCs are beginning to appreciate the role that sanitation units can play, and even the role that digital innovation can help them to facilitate their work as a district assembly.
I think that we have seen a lot more of the impact of the evidence we generated at the local level, more so than at the national level. Because at that level, there are opportunities for initiatives and innovations to address in a very simple way, not in a very big structural way, to address some of the challenges and the issues around service delivery that comes about. So we've seen a lot more of that. We've seen instances where citizens have used that information to demand accountability. They've asked their duty bearers, why are we where we are? Every year when we publish the report, it gets the attention of both policymakers and citizens. I think that for me is quite very significant. That the idea that now citizens have more information, so transparency around information about how government is performing relative to these services, and they are able to assess the efficiency, resource allocation outcomes, for me is quite very important. And every year we publish this, you get a lot of conversation, a lot of dialogue around about how do we make government more accountable. We've also seen the fact that this evidence is being used by development partners, for example, to initiate their own projects and programs and interventions at local levels. UNICEF, for example, that is big on sanitation issues, particularly investing and focus on areas where there are problems that they need to address. You would find the World Bank, you would find the UNDP, you would find JICA, you would find other international development organizations that are quite very interested in this and initiating projects and interventions based upon the evidence that is provided. You would also find CSOs by themselves, our own colleagues in the space who use the evidence to sort of initiate and design their own interventions that respond to that. There are a couple of things. One of it is the fact that the data and the evidence we use is data that's generated by the state itself, by the government itself. And so the question about credibility, legitimacy is out of the way. In this case, the evidence that we use is really evidence that is annually generated by the state about its own performance. All that we did is to do an analysis of that evidence and to sort of generate a performance ranking system that then says that, across this space of our local government, these are how the state, the central government and the local government are performing relative to these key services for citizens. I think that is one of the things that sort of got it accepted. Additionally, in my mind, is the fact that we don't do the national launch and end there. The attempt to do regional and district level forums where then you disseminate the information, you bring in citizens to create an interface where they can have a conversation and look at the report and discuss the report in detail. I think it's also a contributory factor, both in terms of creating awareness, but also most importantly, strengthening the supply and demand of accountability around the evidence that we generated. The question about whether CSO-generated data can find space in public policy, and to what extent, and by whom, and for what purpose. I think that has been a very important struggle for us. It's a fight between policy and politics. And for younger and emerging democracies such as us, it's a continuous struggle. How do you balance that? You have an elections in the next 4 years to win. What is it that is salient, what is important for your electoral win?
Data is not readily available all the time. Issues around even the timeliness of getting that data and how people interact with the data, and even the capacity to use the data has also been an issue sometimes. There are lots of issues around funding. A lot of this is still funded by donors and international CSOs. So even where we have the data, there are still big gaps. The latest DLT showed that of all the indicators they looked on, the sanitation one was the one that had the most gaps.
It's about poor prioritization. That if they prioritize well and understand that sanitation is very important to human development, human dignity, quality of life, then they'll put it at the top. The accountability element is still missing. How do we ensure that all those who are given that stewardship, that responsibility to roll this out, are actually doing so? We want government to fulfill. And often government delays. It doesn't just delay, but sometimes it fails to actually deliver on that commitment. So it's a big barrier for us engaging them to deliver on that.
Information is important. That in of itself may not produce anything, but when it is put in a certain form, it can generate citizens' anger, it can empower citizens, and that can lead to behavioral changes that would affect governance outcomes.
CSO and government collaboration works. I think it's critical for governments, especially in our region, to recognize that CSOs link up with the people, they work with the people directly. So they have a way of representing the people's voice in ways that are meaningful and useful to government. And so instead of feeling antagonistic about what CSOs do and bring to the table, it really helps when government is more open, accommodating, and ready to work with CSOs. I think also that it's a lesson for government to recognize that CSOs are credible, especially when it comes to information from the grassroots, but also for CSOs to learn how to work with government. Because in this particular case, they involve the government right from the start, and the data they use is actually government-generated data. So you don't have disputes around where did this data come from, why are you using it? And I think that's one of the successes of the DLT and I'm Aware programs.
We're going just beyond the traditional water sanitation stakeholders to now getting the Ministry of Education, Ministry of Health, Ghana Health Service, Ghana Education Service involved in sanitation delivery. So you don't tackle sanitation from just one perspective or one angle. For us as an institution, we look at sanitation in communities or households. Ghana Education Service will ensure that there's sanitation in schools. Ghana Health Service will ensure that there's sanitation in healthcare facilities. So that's how we're now approaching and they're just working together. So it's now multi-sectoral.
That as CSOs, you don't think that in of yourself you can drive social change without government, that you can mobilize citizens and they can drive change. Government certainly has a very important central role to play in driving change. How you partner with government, how you design your intervention with government, how you get government involved, how you get key important bureaucrats, those we call champions.
If I were to single out this particular book as a very important contribution on the research front alone, what's interesting for us is because we are not academic researchers, we're activists in practice in terms of what are we learning from the ground and how are we reflecting on it and how is that helping us understand where the gaps between theory and practice are and how can we bring the African context to bear much more significantly in the theoretical development that underlies much of the practice of using evidence for decision making. So I think this book is particularly useful in allowing a wide body of case studies that's showing us how those tensions in practice are so different to how the theoretical literature is actually speaking about it. And I think for learners who are wanting to move into this arena, let alone policymakers, it's always really helpful to see how context in practice is quite different. And I think the second key contribution of this work is the analytical framework that is in and of itself methodologically an innovation that I hope would not only help our organization in feeding our own research agenda, but also be much more widely used with people that are active in the evidence-informed policy-making discourse.